What I want to talk about in this video is to compare the three main methods that insulin is given in the hospital and the reasoning behind these, specifically long-acting insulin, mealtime insulin, and the insulin sliding scale. This will only be an overview, and we'll have more videos that touch on each of these topics in more detail hopefully soon. Let's first talk about long-acting insulin. There are numerous types, but the one that we use most often is called Lantus, which is an insulin that acts at a consistent rate over the course of 24 hours. Because of its consistency and 24-hour coverage, you only need to give Lantus insulin once a day. But remember that it's very important to give it at the same time each day, or else you're going to have areas of overlap and lack of insulin coverage, which will affect your glucose control. For example, let's say you have a patient who normally takes his Lantus insulin at 8 a.m. each morning. So on day 1, he gets his Lantus at 8 a.m. and effect lasts 24 hours, so until 8 a.m. the next day. But on day 2, instead of taking his Lantus insulin at 8 a.m., he forgets and takes it at 12 p.m. instead. And so the Lantus then covers from 12 p.m. on day 2 to 12 p.m. on day 3. But on day 3, the patient takes his Lantus insulin at his normal 8 a.m., which lasts for, again, 24 hours. And so what happens is that in this area here, we have double coverage of insulin, so the patient is at risk for low glucose levels. And over here, we have lack of insulin coverage, so the patient is at risk for hyperglycemia. And so this is to illustrate why it's important to take your Lantus insulin at the same time each day. To make sense of how to use long-acting insulin, let's look at this chart. We're looking at a patient's glucose levels over the course of a day. Let's say that our goal is to maintain a sugar level underneath 120, illustrated by this dotted line. If we look at this patient's glucose levels, we see that's about at 150 for its foundation. So what we want to do is to give long-acting insulin like Lantus to bring this down under our goal of 120. And so the goal will be to shift your glucose graph from this to something like this. And again, the reason we can do this is because Lantus works consistently over the course of 24 hours. However, notice that even though we brought the patient's glucose level foundation under 120, there still remains spikes at 8 a.m., 12 p.m., and 8 p.m. respectively, times often associated with eating. What's going on here? This is where I'm going to start talking about mealtime insulin. When you eat, so at 8 a.m., 12 p.m., and 8 p.m., sugars and carbohydrates from your meal get into your blood, which is why you have these spikes in your glucose levels. You're probably thinking, isn't that bad? The answer is yes, that's bad, which is why you need to give the patient short-acting insulin, often insulin lispro, aka Humalog, or insulin aspirate, aka Novolog, in order to smooth out these spikes. And so if you give mealtime insulin, the idea is that it would smooth out the peaks due to eating, like so. Now, these short-acting insulins start acting in 5 to 15 minutes depending on the brand, so you want to administer these about 5 to 15 minutes before you start eating. Needless to say, if the patient isn't going to eat, don't administer mealtime insulin, as this will cause his glucose levels to drop. How much mealtime insulin to give depends on how much and what the patient eats and how resistant he or she is to insulin, but we'll talk about this in another video. Just remember that this is done through estimating the amount of sugar and carbohydrates your patient is about to eat. The last method of insulin administration we're going to talk about is the insulin sliding scale. Let's again use the number of 120 as our glucose level goal. All the insulin sliding scale says is this: for a certain amount above 120, give a certain amount of short-acting insulin. For example, and this is completely hypothetical, if the patient's glucose levels are between 120 to 130, give 1 unit of insulin. If the patient's glucose level is between 130 to 140, give 2 units of insulin. And this goes on and on and on. It's a sliding scale because the higher your patient's glucose level is above your goal, the more insulin you give. You can choose how often to check glucose levels and how often to give short-acting insulin. For example, every 4 hours or every 6 hours. To visualize how a sliding scale works, imagine that your glucose levels rises throughout the day. Then you give insulin according to the sliding scale to correct it. Your glucose drops down, but then slowly rises again. So you give insulin according to the sliding scale again, which causes your glucose to drop again, and this just repeats over and over and over and over again. Notice that while this keeps your glucose levels within a certain range, there's a lot of peaks and valleys, which is why a sliding scale by itself isn't an ideal method to control glucose levels. Now, a few more points. Different patients respond differently to insulin, so there are different insulin sliding scales, some more sensitive and some more resistant. For example, for a more resistant sliding scale, if your patient's glucose level is between 120 and 130, you give 2 units of insulin instead of 1 unit of insulin as you would in a regular scale. Something that I used to get confused about was if you could give mealtime insulin and sliding scale insulin at the same time. The answer is, of course you can. For example, it's noon, you're about to eat enough to warrant 3 units of mealtime short-acting insulin, and your glucose level was just found to be 130, which is 10 above your goal of 120. You're on a sliding scale that says for glucose levels between 120 and 130, give 1 unit of short-acting insulin. So at this point, you would give 4 units of insulin total, 3 units to cover for the meal, and 1 unit to correct for your elevated glucose level per the insulin sliding scale. Finally, here are our take-home points. Please take a few moments here to pause and read these over yourself. Thank you for watching.